that and send out I send out a recording at the later today, along with the slides and any notes or resources that maybe come up in the conversation worth, not to overwhelm you. So there'll always be a follow-up to this, and you'll always get a reminder of the next workshop. But of course, anytime that you have a question, if something doesn't quite resonate with you and you're right, please email me, put it in the chat, and we'll address it as soon as and quickly as we can. But let me share my slides and we'll just get going. And I'm going to rely on, since I don't have a co-facilitator for the smaller group that you can see, we don't need to have the last slide up. We need to have the first slide. There we are. So we'll be going, every Tuesday, at the same time for the next 6 weeks. So let's just walk through what that looks like. As we just did the introduction, so just want to review, making sure everybody, we're meeting your goals as much as whatever, we're trying to attempt what we'll get to at the end of 6 weeks, which is one of the goals is that each of you have a digital story that you can screen at the end of this workshop with your peers here, and then share it to whoever you want to share it with after. We're going to look at what we call the 7 steps, just a kind of foundation to how we see story and digital storytelling interact. And I think it'll be be clearer when we get to that. Obviously, screen stories is the best way to sort of describe what it is we're asking you to commit to in the making of digital story by looking at some. And there's such a range, right? And these are just some, and there's some reasons why the ones I chose are the ones I chose for this workshop. You might not see it in the subject matter, but sometimes it's more about how the story is told. There's always the what the story is about, but how people tell the stories that they feel compelled to tell in this workshop. We'll just look at some writing prompts. I know they don't always work for everyone, but just some ways to help sort of maybe shake the tree a bit if people are not quite sure the story. So just some questions, some way of thinking about your own story before we leave this session. So we've done that. And just a few things about the way, our workshop, and in particular, the way I like to structure the workshop. It's as much hands-on experiential as possible. It's an iterative process. There's no right or wrong. I mean, people might orient themselves to what's right or what's wrong, or for themselves, I did it wrong. But that's not the way, there's no grading. That's not the way I approach it. It's all a bit of an exploration. A lot of people have not, we tell stories all the time, but we don't necessarily consciously write them down and then reiterate them, record them, and then create something out of them, right? Some do, maybe some are writers, and maybe some are making short little films. But most of us don't do this. And so we're all amateurs to some extent, but the power of this is sort of awakening our sort of storytelling sort of animal, and finding this way of expressing it through our sound of our own voice, the decisions we make about the words we want to speak, and also the visuals, the images, the video clips, the grandfather recordings that we want to incorporate into it, the way that we can imagine our story being, we want it to be told. And so, yeah, we're going to give you some techniques, some how-tos. And we want to make sure that it's interactive, that, everybody here has some expertise, whether we know it or not, and just want to make sure that the group is supporting each other. Because we have this gap between week to week, it's not you must do, but there's some sort of markers moving forward. So you will be set up as best can be for each session. So we just some things just to provide you with guidance between each session, to come prepared for the next session, and that there's support in between, by emailing me at any time. And so you're this cohort I'm sort of following. I've got 2 other classes that I'm teaching simultaneously, but this one will have its own connection to me. I'll help tell you how to reach me if you want to book a Zoom 30 or 60-minute time. So there's a Calendly link that I send out, and you can look at my calendar. And if you need to just stop in for 30-minute chat, if my calendar is open, then I will be available to chat. Again, if there's any questions. Oh, and I'm just going to go through the agenda just to make sure. Oh, and 6 weeks, only 6 classes seems short, but 6 weeks can be long. And things can happen, right? I mean, Kalena, right? You're familiar. All of a sudden, it's not quite the right time. You can opt out, come back into another workshop later if it's just too much at this time. Or if you need to miss a class or be late, we can catch you up. I can catch you up. Just give me as much heads up in how you're doing in your busyness of life. And digital storytelling in my world is important, but of course it's not important in the big scheme of things. So just keep me posted and abreast of what's if you need to miss a class or be late or leave early. So session 1, introductions. We just want to get you sort of a little bit of foundation, feeling, somewhat 2 feet planted on the ground. Like, oh yeah, right. This thing called digital storytelling. I have a better understanding now, what that means and what my tasks are going to be moving forward. And the 7 steps being key to that, as well as looking at some stories and just having us talk a bit about them. So between session 1 and session 2, there'll be some writing. This idea that we have ideas of stories. Some people have sort of articulated a little bit of what they're hoping to tell stories about or how they want to use them. It's in our head. Getting things down out of our head so we can visit that outside and look at it, how we talk about it or write about it. Talking about it will be key. Changes, right? It gives a different relationship to the thing that swirls in our head with all the other messiness going on. So if we get it down, out, and revisit it that way, we have a different point of view to it, perspective. So that's important. So that's what we'll do between 1 and 2. Hopefully this class will give you some ideas, start sparking something that you can sort of like jot down a list or start writing even, or start looking at some photographs with a particular lens. Session 2 is where we're going to take whatever that comes out of this session, whatever is churned up between this week and next week, to bring into what we call story circle is what we call it. I like to call it story sharing, or just a sharing process to say, here's my story idea. This is what's resonating with me. This is the thing that it's the pebble in the shoe. So I need to sort of talk it out, put it to the group. And then through this, it'll be just this group. We won't break up. We'll stay in this group of 5. Just get this reflective feedback, affirmation and feedback, and we'll give the guidelines to how that works next week. But that's where things, if you just, now you're speaking them, or maybe they are on a page, and you're now talking them out to peers, all of a sudden, again, our relationship to it starts to change. It either goes, well, that all of a sudden it's not feeling right, but this other thing has come up in my sharing. I'm going to go down that path. So again, this is just an iterative process moving you towards a finished digital story. But from that, whatever it is that you wrote, there's a revision. It could be writing, all of a sudden what was a list is now what I would call a script, or maybe it's a kind of creative essay, or maybe it's knowing which part of an interview to extract out and start with that. So there's just some way that it starts to help us hone in and focus on where we're heading with our story and what the story's about, and why we're telling it is important too. And then we're going to do it again. So since you're revising the script, and say, thank you for that feedback last week. I thought about it, and this is my new approach. Some people say, I scrapped that, but something else came up and I just ran with it, and this is what I've got. So we'll reshare where we're at with our stories in week 3 as a way to, like, sort of quote unquote refine it, get it to where you feel comfortable recording it. So we're going to talk about how to record your voice, and so the tricks of the trade, but also how to use WeVideo. So we'll make sure that everybody's up and running in WeVideo by week 3. We might even have a chance to do that today, since we're a small enough group. So between 3 and 4, the idea is to get that voice recorded. That's the foundation of the digital story. Once you've got that voice recording digitized, recorded, and in video, that's the sort of foundation, and we build our visuals up on top of that. So it kind of does work as a storyboard. Ziva, you were talking about a storyboard. So there's official ways of doing storyboarding, and there's particular storyboard artists. We're approaching it as a slightly more organic process. So once that voice is saying what it's saying, how do we want to illustrate that? What else do we need people to see as we're saying things? So there's that relationship to the sound of the voice and the visuals. And that's what session 4 is about. We'll talk a little bit about it in the abstract on week 3. Week 4, we're going to put it to practice. We have a voice recording by another storyteller, and we have some visual materials, and we can practice, and I'll just help guide you through the use of WeVideo and all that platform allows you to do in the video editing space. So the idea between 4 and 5 is you have a rough edit, what we call a rough edit, which is your voiceover recorded in WeVideo and a sequence of images or visuals synchronized or in some kind of sequence alongside of that voice. That's a rough edit in our parlance. So week 5 is to kind of enhance that, look at some of the special features. There's things like pans and zooms, there's transitions, there's what we call compositing or layering multiple images on the screen, montaging, all that will sort of give you some creative sort of ideas. You might have your own creative ideas, and we'll explore how to do those in WeVideo. And we might continue working with the sample materials, but if someone's at a particular place with their story and they want to get group feedback to where they're at with their own digital story, we'll use that as a kind of learning, as a learning platform, your own story. So we'll see if anyone's willing to share their rough edit in session 5. So the goal is coming out of session 5 that you have a pretty good sense of what else there needs to do. We'll have things like, do I want more music? Do I need other sounds? Did I find that image that I couldn't find? Now I find it, how to put that in. So sort of, and how to finalize and export a final movie, which we'll screen in week 6. And then, there should be a little bit of time just to kind of follow up on, there were some goals personally, and maybe good to reflect on how this impacted you just on a personal level, but also how you might take this forward into the work that some of you are doing in your own endeavors, and how we can support that moving forward. So that's the agenda. As I said, the little bits of things at the end of each week that I will sort of say, if you can work on this, will help you be sort of prepared and set up each week. But again, we know that things can happen, and sometimes the week gets away on us and we don't get anything done. But there's a lot of time to catch up, and there's a lot of opportunities in between classes asynchronously to contact me and meet up with me, and we'll get everybody crossing the finish line at the same time. All right. Take a break here. We'll take a more formal break in a minute. Let me just keep going. So I like to start with a few definitions, just a few sort of ways to see if people have any questions or pushback, their own ways of articulating why we tell stories for a start. And, I think it was maybe Jamie that was sort of, her anthropologic sort of, that was maybe something you wanted to do or be, and there's this quote by this linguistic anthropologist from UCLA, which, I don't know where I found it. There's a book, I think, about narrative something. So I don't know, it was just some quote that came across my 20 years doing this work, and I loved it for a number of reasons. First of all, it talks about personal narrative, how, stories are constructs. We have experiences, but when we're telling stories, like, why am I late? Happens a lot. My husband's like, you're not home on time. What happened? And I have to tell a story. And I choose to put some details in, and maybe I leave some out, right? So I create a personal narrative. That's how we have experiences. We have to sort of find a way to articulate that experience without it just being a documentation, like a list of like a timeline or something like that. And that gives it, all of a sudden you have a shape to that experience. It's like, it has a beginning, has a middle, has an end. And we do that two things come out of it. We're doing that kind of like to, and it's, kind of figure out what was that experience about? Why was I held up on the way home? Like, why did I stop in at the pub? Um, this is just, I'm fabricating. This isn't what happens in my life, but that helps us understand who we are. So first of all, it's a personal journey. The story of my Camaro was a personal journey about that photograph, which was like a joke to my family, in particular my mother, who saw me as someone she didn't want her son to be or something, which then takes us to the second part of this is we use the stories to apprehend the experience and navigate relationships with others. So when I showed that story to my mother, and other people have seen it, right? But my mother was like, well, she had a little pushback, but she was the one that wrote on the back of that photo, Rob's macho period, right? So it was a way for me to reclaim that. And she could, and in a relationship to her, this isn't your story, Mom, this is my story. And again, in that culture of humility, the experience and the expertise in that, why that person's leaning up against a Camaro, is who they are, right? Who I am, the way I see myself, not how someone else sees myself. And all of a sudden I have a story that reclaims my personal experience. And I had to sort of think about it because maybe I was thinking I was macho, whatever. But it's this idea that we tell stories simultaneously to navigate our own experiences. What was that about? Why is that important? What did I learn? What do I want to share? What don't I want to share? And through that sharing, because that stories, we want to share our stories, it allows the relationship to be built. And so stories, to me, at the heart of this, and when we're thinking about your own stories, like what is the relationship I'm trying to understand for myself and maybe share to someone else? So that's a bit of audience there. And it could be another person. It could be a relationship to a place. It could be your relationship to a philosophy, an idea, an issue, politics, whatever. It's your relationship to that. And you're trying to show that to yourself. Yes, that's who I am. And someone else is saying, oh, that's who you are. That's what you say when you say this. So they understand us better. Does that make sense? We understand ourselves. And that's, I think, why we tell stories. So if we can embrace that we're trying to tell these stories, not just cut and paste, but we're trying to dig in a bit to meaning making. Where do personal narratives sit in this sort of ripple out of stories? Well, personal narratives for me and for us at Story Center, there's like three main areas that we can extract our stories from. The me story. Other people might have owned a Camaro, but my story, well, this is the me story. It's the kind of journal. If I was to be a diary keeper and write all the things that happen and the way I'm feeling about those things, if I extract that and want to sort of publicly or share something out, I'm pulling from my experiences that no one else would know about, right? It's the thing that happened to me on the way to the gym or something, right? It's my very specific experience that maybe I want to figure out for myself. And by doing that, I'm going to share that out so they understand me better. My story, I differentiate that as more like, well, there may be a bunch of people have different experience, same thing, but different experiences to it. So it could be, anything that's happened, the pandemic, for example. My story through the pandemic or, is everyone's lived through that, but we each have our own stories through that same, right, shared experience. So that's the difference. The me story is just very, very sort of distinct and unique. And the my story is something that maybe everybody will have a point of view about. And the our story is, I find this is this idea of sort of cultural, sort of where the storyteller is sort of speaking on as part of an identity. And so, yeah, it's their own experience, but they're telling a story about a collective, the way that they know that they identify with their peers, their neighbors, their community, right? And that's a slightly different one too, right? So there's an awareness about whose shoulder to shoulder you're with, right? Or maybe even whose shoulder you're standing on, right? and that's the our story. And the their story is that kind of journalistic observer, right? It's like, well, I went into this community and saw this. Let me tell you about that thing I saw, right? But they don't tell it from a person with any personal lens. They just kind of like document it. And, we see those, they're important. We extract things from what other people say and we create something. We might not even narrate it, but we're not putting ourselves at the center of the story or even in some kind of witness to it. We're sort of standing back. Some people try and make those into digital stories. We try and shift you to say, well, why is it your story to tell? Who are you in the story? So that'll always be something, why are you telling this story? You'll hear me sort of push back or at least give that as a framework to see if there's a connection to who you are in the thing you're trying to express. And the no story is the data, right? And people, the business school or, a lot of, I work with public health, like students of public health at Columbia. I've been doing that for 6 years now, and they're immersed in data all the time. But of course, they're public health. So they're always trying to figure out, well, what does this mean to humans, right? The humanness of healthcare. And so that's to shift the no story into a story. And that's really interesting to watch people shift out of data and find the stories and the data points. So that's story and digital story and sort of where, you might find where you want to position yourself in the center of your story or, really adjacent to the issue. You have a point of view. You're not necessarily in the center, but you have a point of view to something that's central. Or you're thinking about, who you are within a community. Digital stories can have all sorts of production to them. They can be one photo. And we'll see some of these, not today, but I'll show one probably next week, a single photo story. The one here with the faucet. Photo montage, which is a sequence of photos, just images, videos. I'm going to show one today. Well, we'll show some both with just all they are is photographs. And I'm going to show you one that's all it is video, little clips, and then combinations. So, these aren't things you have to decide now, but at some point, words turn into recorded voice. And then there's a visual way that you want your story to be experienced. And you'll be making these decisions as you move. This one here, we might see it with the dog here in the middle down below. That's a story that has no speaking in it. There's some text on screen, and it's the sequence of the visuals that allows the story to be told. All right. I'll just go through these quickly, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and watch some stories, if that's all right. Are there any questions? Anything? This is the most lecturing you'll get in the 6 weeks. This is just, again, foundation stuff. And hopefully you're taking notes or at least something's resonating with you. So stories, help us navigate for ourselves, relationships to ourselves, to places, to others, things in our purview. And, there's the me story, the my story, and the our story. So in that, let's sort of dig down into that to even more of a scaffolding, what we call the 7 steps. Now, you notice it says 7 steps, but there's no 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This isn't, an IKEA assembly, the steps on how to build the Billy bookcase assembled, right? Get that box from IKEA and you get these sort of, bare minimum instructions, and you kind of have to go 1 through 8, and next thing you know, you have a bookshelf. That these are things that you're going to be kind of thinking about answering questions that you're posing yourself, or we're going to ask questions in our story sharing around things like insight, emotion, right? Well, let me dig into these a bit. So the way I look at these 7 is there's 2 definitive, well, not definitive, but there's two main areas of those 7 steps. Owning your insight, owning your emotion, finding a moment. Just think about those for a second. And you think about telling your own stories, right? In that sense of trying to understand relationships and that experience that happened to me, that after that, I'll never do that again. That's insight. And I'm saying it with like some sort of sense of remorse. There's emotion, and there's an experience, something happened. That's a moment, right? There's your story. Maybe it's in the moment, but the story isn't there until you start reflecting on like, what was that about? And why does that hurt so much? Or why does that make me chuckle? Or why do people think that's weird, right? So now we have the why question that we're trying to answer, which is when we answer that question, it's like that's your insight. And when we're asking that question, if it's insightful enough for us to think about those questions, it's emotional. And so our stories are built around what we know, what we're trying to understand, figure out, and telling those stories to help us figure out why it's important, emotion, because it really matters. If I don't tell this, my daughter is going to think I'm, whatever. So there's emotional connection to our own experiences, the ones that matter. And again, place and time is where those experiences happen. So if we can just sort of just get rid of, the kind of like, in a lot of our academic or even our emails in the workspace, we're always trying to like navigate and trying to like helicopter, justify, give all sorts of like references and why, without even telling the story. So really, if we can just go to a place and a time when something meaningful happened and it made you feel in a particular way before and then you feel different after, in there is where your story is. The narrative that you can help you build. Story is in there, right? That story. The digital part is, well, we're going to hear your voice. It's going to be recorded. You're going to share a recording. You're going to see things, right? You can describe them in the telling, but this is an opportunity to show some things. Literally have through the digital video editing, you're going to show images, right? Assembling, all of a sudden we're producing it. We're assembling the story to tell, maybe as we're getting out the car to come in the house to tell how am I going to, excuse myself, this, whatever. That sort of production. But this is in the visual, the sound of your voice, how fast you speak, the cadence, all of those things are part of assembling your story. So there's a production side of it. That's the digital aspect. And the sharing your story means you have this artifact, this digital artifact that you can share. So I like to think of those first three of you can just settle into those. Don't worry yet about the visuals just yet. Just think about things that are important to you. Why do I want to tell this? What happened? What was that about? Those are all questions just around story. Now what visuals do I want to see? What's the pictures? What are the video clips? How do I want people to experience it visually? Is there a soundtrack to this? Do I hear music? Is there other sounds? That's all production. That's all the digital aspect of it. Right? Still part of storytelling, but you're now shifting into the digital storyteller. Does that make sense around the distinction? All right. So that's a really rush through the 7 steps. Through this presentation, there's we may well see if we can pull out some specific questions to ask, the way they're a little less rambling that I just did specifically to those 7 steps. Or if you have questions, right, please put them in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask them. But let's watch a digital story. So let's just go back to those 7 steps, insight, emotion, moment. So sometimes there's a little bracket S, because sometimes this moment led to this moment, that it's a kind of combination of moments, but it has to start somewhere, right? There is a time and place. Something happened. So look for those in all the stories. And then think about what you see, what you're hearing, how it was put together, and the fact that this person has permitted us to share their stories in this teaching environment. Here's the first one. If you don't hear it, let me know so I can make sure that the audio is on. But here we go. I won't set this up. We'll watch it, and then we'll come back and discuss it.
The year my mother joined her people, I planted 1,000 tomato seeds for a yard that can only sustain 10 plants. This is the kind of insanity that grief breeds. My mother died in January 2019. By February, my narrow windowsills teemed with exotic names. Azoishka, Constelluto Genovese Silvalente, Drusba. I grew so many black tomatoes, but in my haste to escape my pain, I forgot to plant seeds for my favorite black, Paul Robeson. I watched the seedlings like an expectant mother. Every day waited for their true leaves to fracture the light. I hoped my mother would show up in May when I sat on the rusted chair, played Nina Simone in a haze of Nag Champa, and transplanted the seedlings to their final resting place. In July, I imagined she grew as impatient as I was, waiting for that first ripe tomato. My mother despised mayonnaise and preferred her love apples almost naked. She sliced them open, placed salt on their innards, then swoon. A foodie long before there was such a word, she learned to make spaghetti sauce from an Italian woman she babysat for in Philadelphia during the 50s. In 1969, we became the first black family on the block in a Levitt suburb, but Maryland never became home to my mom, aka Aunt Sis, Nana, E.T. She wrote a children's story she loved to read me about an African princess named If Me. Had an IQ of 180. My mom left so many dreams unmet, wobbling on the kitchen floor. Until the multiple myeloma came, she loved to brag. No one in our family ever gets cancer. In October, I was still clipping diseased leaves from the plants in a futile attempt to stop the death. But everything that makes the soil sweet comes from decomposition. My mom weighed less than 90 pounds the last time I saw her alive. As her breath waned, the plants outside her hospice window whistled in the cold evening air, like the dead plants I just couldn't bury. My brother thinks I should grow fewer, but I won't. Growing tomatoes is the one place where I can find my mother and not collapse. In my garden, salt tastes like sweat, not sorrow. If I could, I would plant 1,000 acres of love apples. And even that would not be enough to cry her back to me.
I'm just going to stop sharing for a minute. Yeah. Let's just look at this story. I promised a break and I went right to that story. We'll just sort of talk about this story and then we'll take a break and see if there's anything else that you think about during the break about this story. But if there's any questions or anything that it resonated with you or you're curious about. Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
The line, growing tomatoes is the one place I can find my mother and not collapse. Like took my breath.
Yeah.
But it is, I think that this parallel between the plants dying and her mother being 90 pounds but finding her mother in that kind of natural cycle of life, that worked really well for me to think about losing a person in that very, very specific way.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, if we look at the things we do in our life as, what's the importance? Well, yeah, tomatoes, so I can put them in my sandwich, right? But that when we start to think about, the things we do, in this case, grieving. I mean, she was planting tomatoes before her mother died, but all of a sudden the tomatoes take on this other vital importance. And yeah, there's just some great line that line, yeah, always gets me too. Anyone else?
I think I had a couple thoughts. One, I love the context that she gives for why tomatoes, like why are the tomatoes specifically important? And coming from that story of her mom growing up in Philadelphia and learning to make tomato sauce from this Italian woman in the 50s before this was like I think like that just adds such a depth to the story. But then also kind of as Amy was saying, one of the lines that really stood out to me was, and I'm not gonna remember it exactly, but basically about how anything beautiful that comes from the soil is born from decay. And just thinking about that, I mean, I think about that a lot because I deal with soil science a lot. But just thinking about how like that process is really, really gross and it's really, really harsh and it's a very like could be viewed as a very dark, cynical cycle, but it's a cycle that once you get through all of that, once you get through the sadness, once you get through the grief, once you get through whatever it might be, you come through something much more beautiful.
Yeah, this sort of decomposition. There's a whole biochemical, scientific, objective way of looking at decay, and this humanizes it, right? It's a metaphor, but it's also the reality. And once we get into that world of subjectivity and object, we all sort of know decay. Oh, but as a way of helping with grieving and recycling that, all of a sudden, right? Yeah, it's interesting. I do remember working with some environmental scientists, and they were trying to describe, the environmental degradation. And I said, it just sounds like the land is tired. And they went, because it had been, over farmed. And they went, yeah, that's it. It's overtired. And people get that, right? It doesn't have to have all the scientific jargon to it. So yeah, good point. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead, Colina.
I was in the workshop when Denise
There you go.
created, posed, and developed this story.
Wow.
Were you the instructor?
No, it was
No,
Daniel.
I don't think it was. Oh, yeah. Okay. So I was in that workshop and
Yeah.
I remember her whole process because when we were having the story circle and she was talking about her mother and the different aspects of things and how it developed into this beautiful piece. It was so poetic and everything. And so it's just interesting to remember that whole
Wow.
process.
Yeah,
and
that's
how it
cool that you have
started.
you had a
Yeah.
certain seat to her process and her production.
Yeah.
One of the things, there's a few things that going on with this story, right? And it's got a sophistication that, what I do know is her mother had died just a year prior. It hadn't even been a year. I think it was coming up to the first anniversary. So it was pretty raw, right? And it wasn't about cancer, although she mentions it, what her mother died of. It wasn't, there's that specific journey of hospice and all that. That was all, I've met Denise since and I've talked to her. But there's this other thing as a way to go back and weave a few narratives. There's Denise's love for black tomatoes. Well, there's something. I never know those existed. It's a actual thing, right? Right? And there's all these species. And so that even that is insightful. And there's learning in that, right? And just a different kind of appreciation to the agriculture, the growing of tomatoes and thinking them outside of these red things that grow on a vine. But there's other things like you picked up on that, Amy, about, a person who had an IQ of 180, who learned how to like what seemed like, well, was that interesting? In the context of maybe breaking myths, thinking outside our determined lenses, our cultural competency, what we think, what we assume, to hear all these other things. So there's a historical, we see old photographs, right? All of these layers are possible because it's not one story about one thing. It's about how grieving, but when you grieve and you have to dig underneath, what's the roots, all that metaphor. And that allowed Denise to just infuse. Her mother hated mayonnaise. She liked her tomatoes naked. even that, right? It's like, there's something to that. That means she's her own individual person who doesn't like mayonnaise. So yes, there's a representation of the Black community in a Lubbock suburb, right? But there's also someone who, cooked and learned from this Italian woman, and there's this woman who hated mayonnaise, and all of a sudden the complexities in a beautiful way. So getting these all bits down, but it comes down to why I'm grieving, and I need to navigate and understand my relationship to myself as I grieve the death of my mother. Start there, and then just hone in on the things that Denise was dealing with, and how she was dealing with it, and what her process was, and all those things just to become. And then the process of like, well, let's just pepper them in there and not worry about a chronological. My mom was diagnosed, right? That would be the death story. This is a grieving story. So
I really liked that I think the thread to me that held it all together was how she was able to convey this isolation and this kind of like theme of being segregated from everything else in humanity that was completely in her story of her mom being like started saying she's going back to her people and you see a group, but everything else is very solitary. It's very small.
interesting.
It's just this one person, and she's separated. She's separated from the larger society. She's separated eventually from her people. She goes into a feeling like community. And there's just these couple of instances where there's connection, but everything else is just like a very small isolation of it doesn't feel like this is a person who is integrated into the larger community. And
Right.
even with her daughter, that you feel that there's this separation from this, from being just, a part of this larger, like she lives in this place, but every single picture and the movement and what she's saying is just like, you're still separated. And so it's still, it has like a different theme, and I really like how she was able to convey like this feeling of this one person, and then you have small families, and we created like this different world of just seeing like the leaves. You see a couple of people, but it was like them in nature, but not really connected to like everything else I feel in like human society and everything else that was
That's
around us.
Thanks for sharing that. And that is a really interesting insight to the experiencing the story. And I think that's really one of the things, and then we'll take a break, is how people receive stories and make meaning of them, right? Like the story, there's Denise and her own, and here I am, she's not here to right. So there's all this interpretation, Kalina, you were there in the workshop, but there's a process that, right? But I hadn't heard to that detail. And now I think about that story, I'm thinking about those isolated photos, right? This idea of sort of looking and seeking a larger sense of community. And maybe that's not exactly how you're saying it, but there's something else going on there. And you see that, and now all of a sudden that story is something that resonates with you in a particular way that didn't for me. And I think that's also the power, right? Which is it's also something, there's not, if the audience is in this case diverse and it's used in all sorts of different contexts, Denise has given us permission. Some people just see it as like, oh, I love those pictures of the plants. And some people look at, oh, I love that. They might find specifics, but what you just described with this overarching thing that you were carrying through the watching of that. And that's something I'm going to pay attention to next time I see it, because now you've opened my eyes into a particular way. That's why these stories are important. They're important to share, because they're more than what we take at face value sometimes. Well, most of the times. All right, we'll come back and watch a couple more stories and maybe go through the 7 steps. But thanks for the first hour. Why don't we take let's 9 minutes, come back quarter after the top of the hour. Does that sound good? Okay, we'll see you at, well, 11:50 my time, whatever it is, quarter after at your time. See you in a bit. Some of the other things. So often, welcome back. Before I go into what I was going to say, is there any reflection again, and we haven't heard from everybody about that story? Anything else you want to say? You know, if you thought about it during the break, did it sort of, you know, sort of continue to resonate? Anything? We'll as we look at other stories, we'll sort of come back to the 7 steps. There was a lot of insight, emotion. I mean, we even hear it in Denise's voice, right? There's these, I wouldn't necessarily say there was this one time when there was, but these very sort of specific sort of memories or relationships, you know, like my brother says I should plant less tomatoes, and there's a picture of him and her mother and him. So there's these sort of, she goes to these very specific small details. And sometimes if you do find moments or their story is about this time when, there's a tendency sometimes to just like do the postcard kind of story, or we write somebody, or we write that, and we just sort of really don't talk about, we say, hey, having a great time, you know, went swimming and whatever. But it's those little details, right? Like the ice cream cone that fell on the lap and then almost got in an accident, or a smell, or something that caught your attention that maybe was, those small little details really authenticate the story because they're deep in our memories, and there means we are connected at this deeper level than just the superficial. And I think part of Love Apples, what's really for me, is Denise doesn't shy away from those small little details, the mayonnaise, the magchampa, the haze of magchampa, those things that are deeply in her memory and her knowing, her insight. And don't like, oh, that's such a small little insequential detail. No, actually it's especially for us that don't necessarily have that very specific, we weren't there. It brings us into the story more. So don't shy away from what maybe seems like an inconsequential little bit of detail. You know, lean into that and see if that helps your storytelling. All right. Oh, wait a sec. I've got to come back to my slides. And continue on. Sorry, I don't know why it's always showing my browser, but we'll just keep going. So these are just in the sense of owning your insights. These are just some ways of sort of thinking about it, right? And just sort of like some kind of, you know, questions to ask, or, you know, affirmations about why insights are vital to storytelling. And insights are part of the reflection process, right? So you're watching these stories, you think of your own stories, reflecting. You don't have to get to the right and the specific writing, but thinking about moments and insights and learned experiences and why you're telling this story, and getting those things down first, just making a sort of almost list, or just as you things come up, just jotting them down, right? Or whatever. Some people will record into their phone just some thoughts and ideas, right? Go for a walk and think about your story, and just make note of it in a different way than just thinking about it as an exercise. That's what we mean by reflection. And that's going to get you into both insights. Of course, you're thinking about a memory, and the ones that sort of stick in the sense of the emotion, the ones that sort of you really say, you know, but it was really about this, you know, this one over that. It's usually an emotional component. It doesn't have to be sad. It just means that it's meaningful to you, and there's a way that you can express it, that of all the things that happened, this is the one for this workshop. I'm going to tell my story around this, because right now it's important, and the importance is part of that emotional sort of connection. So that's all part of the reflection. And then of course moments are just you know, taking yourself back, whether it was yesterday, the stories about something that happened yesterday that maybe made you rethink about something that happened 20 years ago, but yesterday was the kind of the trigger, or the, you know, not to use it in the sort of therapeutic way, but in this idea, just like, oh, right, that happened yesterday. Oh, that happened to me 20 years ago, but different. And now you have something to sort of anchor your story to, in a sense, a moment of time and place. Like this story by Ravathi. So I can't remember, maybe it was Yuziva, that working maybe with exchange students, you took some students over to, and it was Ganea. I think that's what you said you took students to. Here's a story of a student that came from India to an exchange program in Arizona, right? You can imagine lots of stories about that, but this is the story Ravathi chose to tell about her experience of being an outsider and coming to a strange place.
I was tired, but excited to meet my host family. I recognized her face before I saw the sign with my name on it. We talked on the drive to her house. She asked about my journey. I learned this was her first time to host girls. How is it to have strangers in your house each year? How can you trust us? I asked. I read your bio, and you must be special if you were selected to come here. She asked about my family and how they felt about me being here. I told her about my mom passing away 6 years ago, how my father was dealing with his depression after losing her, and how my sister and I started working at an early age since my dad lost his job because of his drinking problem. Despite all of this, my family was beyond happy to see me in this program. I was surprised that I had poured out so much of myself in the first 30 minutes of meeting her. Something about her trusting me from just reading my bio made me want to trust her too. My host dad waited by the door and welcomed me with open arms. We continued our conversation over dinner. He also listened like he was really interested in me. Then it was time to shower and go to bed. I had already undressed when I realized I had forgotten a towel. I stood in the bathroom trying to decide what to do. I'm really modest. I was hesitant to call out to her, but the bigger issue was, what should I call her? I stood there for what seemed like a long time. Finally, I called out, "Mom!" hoping she could hear me down the long hallway. I was amazed at what I had just said. I hadn't used that word for a long time. My host mom came immediately asking what I needed. That's exactly what my mom would have done.
Thoughts about that story? You know, you see any of the 7 steps in that? How did it differ from the first? There's some significant differences, and maybe they're too obvious, but what were your thoughts? Let me just say, it's a story about a lost mother. I mean, that's a component of it, but it resonates differently with us.
I think one of the biggest differences is that it's very firmly rooted in a specific moment and a specific interaction. And I think that pulls on a very different heartstring because you have this like very concrete moment of time where she needed help and she received the help without having to ask more than in simple words.
Right. It's a compressed, I mean, the details about the family dynamics and their father and, you know, there's some things that she pulls in, but it really is from a car picked up at the airport to jumping into, like forgetting a towel in the shower. So the compression of that time And then you bring in these other details that gives it, it's not just, hey, I remember they tell you the time when I didn't have a towel, that we have this heartstring because of those little infusions, right? Yeah, it's a really good point. It's a very distinct moment, and the story is contained inside that.
The
Anyone else?
visuals in this one were very striking to me, how you pan up, and so you're just starting to see the bottom of their faces, and then you see the faces of her
And they're
host mom.
smiling, right? And
Yes.
joyful, yeah.
Yes, and then when the picture of her and her mom comes in at the last minute, I thought that was very compelling.
Yeah, yeah. Right, in conjunction, is I hadn't heard that, I hadn't said that in a long time. And we're hanging with that. And then we see, you know, in that beautiful sort of the words stop in that last picture holds our attention a little longer on that, you know, what was starting to determine, you know, the loss and, you know, having to navigate, you know, without a mom.
I thought the holding the picture on the clothing that long was really good because it really showed the difference in the two cultures.
Yeah, yeah, right. There's
Very
a
obvious.
very, yeah, we, you know, it's obvious. There's a particular cadence and accent to the person speaking English. It's not their first language, and we hear an accent, right? And then we see, and we, yeah, so it's like there's a separation of cultures as we move up. And so it's just, we're having to make some sense. We're having to hold our breath. We're having to hold, where's this taking us? What are they going to look like? Where's the story going? It started at an airport. We're now in, you know, in a host family's home having dinner. It's going somewhere because we're panning up. Oh, there's a bit of a, you know, I'm a modest, you know, like, you know, we're seeing a bit of, uh-oh. You know, sometimes stories are about those little awkward moments, either mistakes or, right? So sometimes, and of all the stories she could tell about being an exchange student, right? Having this experience in a foreign country with a host family, right? And she just tells it through this lens. 3 pictures. I mean, that was the other thing too, right? The first one is just, is that the road from the Scottsdale airport or wherever it is that she landed? It's just, I'm in a car with a stranger and we're having a conversation. The story starts there. The digital story starts there. Doesn't start, you know, getting on a plane, being, you know, sent off by your family. We get that through the conversation she has. So finding a starting point. And sometimes it is like the phone rang. I got in a car. You know, a stranger came to town, that kind of thing. So finding a starting point in a moment that has resonance and going from there. But 3 photos, and Denise's was full of photographs, historical ones, family ones, little detailed ones, right? And very, very much of, there's a visual journey, and it was all, you know, color, black and white, right? It was just this hodgepodge, almost like you're just laying out photographs and everything is bubbling up. And this one was in a car, host family, and then the setup to the one with as you said, Amy, with the 2 side by side, that is incredibly powerful. So different structure, different way of seeing the story. She didn't talk about, it wasn't about, like, let's not just talk about my dad and his struggles. We actually feel for this. We don't judge. We don't, like, it just sits there as part of the narrative, but we keep moving forward. So we know that we take that forward. So when you're thinking about your story, again, it doesn't have to, some stories you need to know the details, because the key thing about why this happened and why this matters is how, you know, the state dealt with my dad, or, you know, how work, right? The story is about maybe discrimination, right? And then you need those details of that. But in this case, that's not what the story is about. She didn't want us to go and judge her father or all this, right? She needed us to say, hey, they're also happy that I'm on this journey. And I mean, you know, they're proud of me, even despite all the hardship. And that's powerful.
I want to say one more thing.
And then Amy.
I like the differences. I mean, even though there's the difference in these people, mom is mom.
Yeah.
And mom
Yeah.
is the one that shows up for you. She's there for you and she hands you a towel.
Yeah.
And it was so sweet.
Right. And if she's not there, right, that sort of mother figure that Denise looked up to, we feel the grief, right? How important Denise's mom, not just the mom, but who she was as a mom, what she represented, what she instilled in Denise is no longer there, and she has to carry forward without that presence. So yes, so that's that relationship, right? And there's different ways you can tell the relationship between a mother and a daughter, or mine's about my mom to some extent because she saw me in a particular way, right? But I didn't like go into the details of all our disruptions. I didn't have, right? But for me, whether people see it so much as that, for me, it was just like getting my story back from my mother's putting me in a box in a particular way. Now, I don't want to get off into that tangent, but when we tell a mother story, we can tell it from a disgruntled son, a grieving daughter, or as someone who is an exchange person who has this moment where she has to think about, what do I call this woman? And I haven't used the word mom in a long time, right? They're all different ways. And that's just, there's, without seeing mine, there's 3 stories that the mom is a central figure, and there's 3 ways of a point of view to tell it. So part of, right, what am I trying to say? What's the meaning? What's the insight I'm trying to convey for myself and to others? And that allows you to like, okay, there's all sorts of ways I can talk about mom. There's the time when we got in this big fight and right? And maybe those were there for Denise, right? It's not like her mom's was like, I'm sure it was all sorts of mother-daughter tension, but you choose the point of view where I want to tell the story from, what place of love, place of grieving and love, place of loss. And all of a sudden now that you stay with that, and right, and allow that voice to be the one that takes your story forward. All right, Amy, you had something to say, sorry.
No, you started to answer my question. One thing that I always struggle with is which details to bring in and which to leave out. Because every story has so many layers, and I tend to be really comprehensive. Both of these stories felt very spare to me. So they chose their details wisely. And I think I hear you saying, choose your details based on your insight on the why. So think about that. But do you have other advice on how to choose details?
Well, we could, next week we'll talk a little bit about that. But the thing is thinking about, there's the 4 C's as a template, sort of what we call connect, context, change, and closure. And we'll go through these details. We'll even look at the story by Ravathi and look at the script and look how she distilled it down, right? And that's what I'll say. Just first of all, just starting the story without, you don't need to context it first. It's like, I got in this car with a stranger, right? I can't remember Denise's. It starts with the day my mom went back to her people. But the first thing we see, these 2 photographs sort of framed, elegant, from a historic, from another time generation, and some music. And we just sort of have to sort of like humming, and that's Denise humming. So it's just, that's a connect. And then she says, the day my mom is the day, right, I planted my tomatoes. There's a starting point. And it's really important, I think, if you find a place that's just a connect for you and how you want, then you're not doing a lot of detailing. Then you say, well, why, and we'll go over this again. And just give us enough of the context to why that connect is important. Right. And it's a little different for the second story because, as Jamie says, it's just in the drive, in the conversation, the dinner, to the shower before bed. It's like, and it's just in there, and you just bring in those details. But if we start like, well, it all started back, but the moment came at 18 years old, then usually it's about the third paragraph in, or actually the story starts when the real meat, the real insight, why you're telling the story is usually 2 or 3 paragraphs in, because we've been trained as sort of like introduction and, prefacing and, like, and all that stuff. And usually I look at a script going, or you recognize it, right? The story sharing next week will like going, ooh, I want to know more about that, right? Someone's like, will say, and then all of a sudden, well, yeah, because, and then off you go. So don't worry about it now. But if you're making lots of messy notes, that's great. Just get those things all down and then recount those sharing. And inevitably someone like, tell me more about that. And then you just move on. So that's why the sharing can be a really important way to get rid of the extra stuff. Okay, let's watch one more. I think if I can, oh, I have to. I got it. All right, there it is. Assume everyone can see. So again, finding the moment is a good place to write. We're just reflecting, just walking and thinking about the story, maybe jotting down some thoughts and some ideas that sort of, oh yeah, it could be this, it could be the story about this. Oh, there was a time, just without the details, just write, that in reflection, getting those down. And then writing usually comes when you say, okay, let me just think about that time when, what happened? Who was in the room, right? Was it winter? Was it spring? Is the seasons important? Is the other person in the room important? Is what happened the day before important, right? That's when you when you find the moment, that's usually when you start writing down some details, right? When you find that scene, right? It might not end up being what the story's about, but it sort of allows you to start and get some things down. And again, don't shy away. If we say why that scene's important, you're now into context. If you write the details of that scene, in Ravathi's, it's the conversation, and through that conversation, trust is built. We hear that, and she doesn't say, and later, well, she was interested in my bio, and she trusted me from that. So I guess I was trusting to tell her these things because she showed trust to me, and off we go. So the moment is kind of important to help you just get what you need to get down. And these are some things to think about. We're going to go into the 4 C's, and here we are with the break. Next week, we're going to look at the script that we showed in another story, and we're going to look at those 2 scripts side by side. One's long, one's shorter. One has a lot of photographs and videos, and one has 3, as 2 does. Here's another one. I'm going to show 2 more. I just love this story because there's a different way. Sometimes in Denise's, there's a kind of writing and then finding that voice and the pace and the way of reading that writing. And it doesn't sound like she's reading. It sounds like she's talking. Same with Ravathi's. And then there's one like Paul, who teaches high school students in underprivileged community. There's just something about this is where the personality comes out. Sometimes he just talks this is the way he was talking in class. And it just felt so unique because his voice really was the person he was, if that makes any sense. Not to say that Denise and Ravathi's not, but there's a kind of writing and voicing the writing. This one is just a voice.
This is the garden in my backyard. These are the sunflowers, which I didn't even plant. They just reseeded from last year all on their own. And same with the poppies, the calendula, the strawberries, the nasturtium, the aster, and even some of the vegetables. Here's my healthiest looking squash, and it emerged all on its own from the compost pile. Even to my bees and my chickens, I often feel I am at best just a good neighbor. Kind of like Scott, who lives next door and reminds me to close the chicken coop on an almost nightly basis. So really, I'm not trying to take credit for all this. I'm just indulging in the joy of watching something beautiful grow. The other day, I walked from my garden down the street to grocery outlet, and along the way I encountered this garden that was built to distract us from something. Throughout the winter, unhoused people were living here, and at some point in the spring they were replaced by some of these garden boxes that now just sit here full of weeds. I will not be bringing my shovel down here to care for these neglected beds. I'd rather smash them up and take the wood down to an encampment for a bonfire. Something that would at least keep someone warm. Maybe they could light their cigarette, sit with a friend, and indulge in the joy of watching something terrible burn.
Three digital stories and three very distinct, I call them voices of just how the story looks and sounds and feels. Thoughts? What did you notice?
I really like that parallel line that I did of the shots. I think it's on the bees the first time where he says like something beautiful grows and then the video ends on something terrible burns.
Yeah, he comes back to something,
Yeah.
but with some the insight. We get the real point of this. He's sort of alluding to something in his, right, and the thing that his anarchy, or what do you want to call it, his rebelliousness, right? Yeah, it's interesting. There's a tension there. The first one is, oh, it's all garden and growing and it's all organic. And at the end, he also thinks about these things that matter to him and to the world and the way he sees the world. And we're back at the bees, right?
I really liked how he was able to convey this feeling of everything is just kind of happening. It's just here. I happen to be here. But it's all very much curated, even in his voice and how he's telling this story. It's very much structured. And so the way that he was able to convey that in the arc of his story, like in the narrative, in the pictures, so that at the end when you see this house,
Mhm.
it's not just all here. And in fact, everything doesn't just appear because there's certain things that are not allowed to continue to flourish. And so I really like that. Like it just really, he was able to make a statement about this, like as if everything is all free and it's natural and whatever happens. And it's like, no, it's not. And
Yeah,
I'm not really as happy with this setting as it seems. It's not idyllic.
right. Yeah, there is a curated, there's he has lots of video of his walk to a grocery outlet, but when he talks about there's a picture of a house with the American flag. So it's very much a statement about the state, right? And governance and power and decision lawmaking and all that. And he never says it. It's just really there. His voice never, it stays the same as you're saying. So there's a kind of intentionality to him, to his politics and his rational and his rebellious and radicalness, right? And he never, right? But it's highly curated for sure. It just comes across, and so it sort of it's sort of like it's a different. It's sort of it sort of it starts to sort of, there's a simmering, and I think Gabriel, you said, at the end, it's sort of like, oh, right. And you might disagree with him, but you cannot deny that experience. It's so real. And it really makes you
It's more
think.
subtle.
It's more
very
subtle, but it sort of gets under you, right? It's like, there's more there than what meets the eye, for sure. Yeah, it's subtle. And it's just video. So there's an example of something, just that he knows is the curation, the sort of the structure of that garden and how he approaches that garden, of letting things just grow and see the good and what comes out of just right without structure, with just letting things be, except for when Scott says, close the chicken coop. There's a few things that are maybe important, but they're minor to this sort of highly structured, rule-based, and the things they put in place go against everything that Paul has gardened and how he sees the world and wants the world to be. And I see those, they're in San Francisco. I now see those boxes and I go, I know why they're there along, right? And so this is also informing, right? There's a kind of insight and wisdom. And again, some people will think, well, I'd rather see those ugly boxes than those homeless, those tents. But now there's a conversation piece, so beautifully done that way. And it's just video. It's just him in the moment filming the things right there. So another production way of approaching it. And this is my point of view about something that is important to me, but there's a way he positions himself to that story. And that's what a storyteller does. It's like, I can tell it from a neighbor being a part of this neighborhood with a garden, or I could tell it from the time I went and protested, at the shutting down of that, and maybe there's a story there, but he decides the point of view is just from someone who allows his garden to be. So as a storyteller, part of that insight is from, do I tell it as a mother, as a daughter, as a professor, as a, right? And there's, depending if you tell it as a professor, is going to be different as you tell it as a community member, right? So, part of your decision as the story you tell is what's your point of view, from what positionality. That'll be important. And there's no right or wrong with that, right? It just means the story's told differently. And it might also be like, well, my students need to know this. But if it's always like, oh, it's another teacher to student story. But if it's like, I tell, like Paul would he showed that to his high school kids, right? Because there's a way of like, they need to know a little bit about, without him like having to sort of like, it just allows them to make an interpretation of who he is without him putting his, again, like he says, even his politics up front. They're subtle, and they sort of like, they see him as a personality, as a character, as a human first, and rather than as a high school teacher. But he showed that to his students. He says they got it. Then they didn't all agree with him, but that's okay. All right. I love that one. That's new. That's new in my repertoire, and it's just someone that I've learned from. And all these stories, right, and how people approach, even of doing this, there's always different ways and different voices and different approaches, and help finding your own path forward. And I'm going to do one more because, it's just video clip. Hearing your story, that's Paul's, just almost like, is he got a script there? Or is he just sort of like, here's, he's almost narrating to the video clips that he's got. Here's my garden. Here's the plants. Here's my bees. Oh, there's my neighbor, Scott. Here's me walking to the store, and here's what I see on my walk, right? It almost, he had a kind of like a curation. He had a beginning, a middle, and then he was taking us somewhere. But it didn't feel a written thing. It felt like someone narrating his own film. So that's something that he heard. I'm not going to show that one. And seeing photographs, video clips. We haven't seen any of the combination of them. And sometimes, you know, can be a little different to stick in a video clip. Sometimes video is a little bit more present. It sort of means this really happened. Photographs, of course, do too, but they're captured in time, and photographs usually are sort of like capture of a memory of a time, and you know, you capture it. Where video sort of puts you right for a moment in that moment, right? Sometimes what you say to a photograph brings us into that moment, right? But photographs, we relate to them differently. We think about them as captured time, where a video clip has time involved, and Paul's is a good example. So if you're thinking about using video, we receive it differently. So, sure. And then assembling, we've seen the differences of that. Let's just watch one more. And this is one that's about, I'll just say that, you know, you don't, even when stories are hard and maybe there were some experiences and memories that were traumatic, what details do you need to say to get the audience, the viewer, to be where you're at, to think about being small in the world? And is there a way of doing that without the details of the oppression? Some stories, again, point of view, no. People need to know the power that I was under, you know, the power dynamic. But here's there's just one way of that Bodine decided to tell her story from this point of view.
We can't see your screen, Robert.
Oh, I'm sorry. Interesting. Thank you. Oh, yeah, I didn't share it. That's why. All right, let's bring it back.
We sat side by side, and I told her I was leaving. She grabbed my wrist and held tightly. I had been there scant 4 months, but I knew in my heart that children deserve better. I wanted to walk away then, but I just sat there with her rigid grasp on my wrist. Suddenly, I was 10 years old again, small and trembling in that long, luminous hallway. My teacher and principal, giant shadows in my memory, scolding me for telling on the aggressions. They told me I would recant my story. I didn't, but I did remain small in my way of being in the world. This moment revealed to me that which needed nurturing. And I wondered, where is it that we go to mend the tears? The tears that cause the fabric to fray in those fragile moments.
we're coming to the top of the hour, so I don't want to, maybe that's a good one to just hang on. But it's any, so video clips, kind of like Paul's videos, but they're used differently. Right. I think the thing about this one to think about is what to show, what to say, what not to say. And so there's a a kind of calm peace that we're seeing in the images. There's attention to the what she had experienced both as a teacher and seeing malfeasance, and then going back to a time where she, even in her small way, stood up to power without the details. So it's really about, like, I think there's people would recognize themselves and where we're feeling disempowered, but how to not waver, dare to, and it doesn't give a solution. It just gives us a kind of way of being and thinking, and just, and it's like, it's almost as a question, right? And the question can be for the people that feel disempowered, but it's also a really interesting question for if people have power, right? To hear that voice, to hear someone who, there's a kind of a very observant person. I think that's why she shows those images, because they're very, very interesting on how she's very observant and is close to witnessing and wanting to honor what she sees. And the beauty of that, and attention to some of the not so pretty things that can happen in a person's life, that the detail. And I think that's really an interesting combination of how you see your story and how you hear your story, and just letting that just linger with you. So this is a story that doesn't have a definitive tying, and I guess all of them. I mean, I guess the second one sort of has this sort of like ending, and this one was like, makes me think about the things that we think about, and the moments and just steps with rain. And it's very open to allow us to move forward with this sort of haunting story. So sometimes the stories don't have to be tied up nicely and tightly. We're left with a kind of a haunting. All right. The only thing, the last thing, and is just, I have these prompts. I will send them out in the prep email. And again, you can almost see some of these stories, maybe they weren't necessarily built on these prompts, but these are just some very open-ended, some more than others. Just think about a time when your life could have gone in two directions. I mean, that's insight is often when we make choices, and what path we chose, that path over that, and there's some insight to why and the consequences of that decision. And then there's also the role about where we're sort of in relationship with somebody, and we tell them something, and the best or worst, meaning, and sometimes telling the stories of our mistakes are really interesting learning, right? So again, that's the best or worst piece of advice. So you can sort of see, again, there's a consequence to our actions that impact others. So already the first one's a kind of a me story. This is a kind of, well, my influence and my bad advice impacted someone else, right? So it's a kind of, there's a relationship already implied. And a third place in your life, not your home, not your work, but a third place. If you just go there, and it could be a physical place, it could be a sort of an emotional place, it could be inside of a book, it can be somewhere, right? And it's up to you to determine that third place. And if you go in that place, what's the story? Is the story about the place? Or is when you go there, it allows you to think about things differently than when you're there as a teacher or as a mother or as a partner or as a, this or that. It's just a place where there's solitude, and what's the story that comes out of that. And well, anytime you're thinking about your story, these are just three questions I would always ask. Say, you can reframe them the way you want, but why am I telling this story? And why now? Well, as a workshop, but is there anything else that brings relevance that you can attach to right away so you're not scrambling for rationale? It also might mean you might have some material that you're dealing with, or it's a lesson you're trying to teach, right? There's some relevance to the moment. And thinking not too, but a little bit about who this story for, which helps you determine from the point of view, from your own position as the storyteller. Again, I mentioned this as a this or that, you know, whoever you want to see yourself as the storyteller. We'll sort of somewhat try to build the relationship to the audience in a particular way. That's it. So we'll be back next week. So just get some thoughts down. Bring those to next week, and we'll go into a story sharing. We'll do it in this group. Your idea, something that, and it could be like, I didn't have time, and it's back to, you know, but it's something to do with this. And that's, and we're like, and sometimes it's through the questions we ask, or the questions you ask for the support you need from this peer group is the feedback that we can start from there. But I'll give you the guidelines to how we approach the sharing next week. Unless there's a question, I'll let you go. If there is something and you didn't want to, you can email me. But I'll send out this recording, which I forgot to do for the second half. I just realized. I think, no, I did. Did I do it? Yeah, stop recording. Okay, I'm going to stop it.